What's your relationship with your engineering team like? Are you constantly at each other's throats, always blaming the other one for delays, always fighting over why the final production UI doesn't look anything like your wires? Are they constantly adding in features to the last minute but never involving the design team? If that sounds like you, it's unfortunately pretty common. You may be working with a low maturity software team. It's super frustrating, but stick around and we'll talk through some ways to improve how you and your engineers can work together. What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome to the show. I am super stoked to have you. And if you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are a regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, then I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. Not just 5 stars, I'm talking about a couple sentences too. Apple loves that stuff, and so do I. That'll help me out way more than you can imagine. And this week's audiobook recommendation is Influencer: The Science of Leading Change by Joseph Grenny, Carrie Patterson, David Maxfield, Ron McMillan, and Al Switzler. And I know the title Influencer sounds like something about social media likes and followers, but that isn't it at all. I had to read this book for a leadership training for work a while back, and this book was really eye-opening for me. The book offers insights into the nature of influence and the vital role that it plays in leadership and enacting change, even when you don't have a position of authority. And that last part is key. It goes through different sources of influence like personal, social, and structural. They go over some real-world examples that use these ideas, and they provide some practical strategies to affect behavioral changes. And I think the ideas in this book have definitely empowered me to be more influential at work, and I think it might help you too. So head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/audible trial to start your free trial and download Influencer: The Science of Leading Change. And make sure you get the second edition, that's the newest one, completely free and help support the show in the process. And I'd like to welcome a brand new patron to this growing list. Kevin, thank you so much for your support. It means so much to me. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Rodney, Megan, Andrew, and John for their support. And if you want to join those fine folks and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you can become a patron for as little as $3 a month. That's less than $1 an episode, and that's a steal. And if you do that, you'll get some sweet perks for your support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then I would love it if you told some friends. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing here, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. Welcome to the second installment of From Clarity to Chaos series. Today we're going to dive into low engineering maturity and some of the things that you can do to get your work done as best you can when your engineering team isn't functioning as smoothly as you would like. This is the second episode. Just a little reminder, in episode 33, we talked about product maturity, but we also laid the groundwork for the series. We talked a lot about overall software maturity of the entire team. So if you haven't listened to episode 33 yet, go take a listen because a lot of what we talked about in episode 33 will be applicable here too. We laid out some of the foundational things that you can do to improve relationships with overall low maturity teams, regardless of if they're software, product, whatever. So make sure to check out episode 33 if you haven't done that yet. So you've all heard about the Nielsen-Norman Group's UX maturity scale, and everybody talks about that, but there are a lot more maturity models out there. Nielsen-Norman Group is obviously not the only one. Unless you're a DevOps leader or just a huge ops nerd in general, you probably have never heard of some of the others. But there are some maturity models that apply directly to software engineering teams. And one of the most widely recognized and applied software maturity model is called the Capability Maturity Model Integration. You might see this as CMMI sometimes. This was developed by the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. The CMMI provides guidelines for improving all the processes that we normally associate with software development. The CMMI model has 5 different levels of maturity, and each level shows a higher degree of process and organizational maturity. It's very similar to the Nielsen-Norman Group's maturity model in that sense. So let's talk a little bit about each level and what that might mean for you as a UX designer. The initial level, level 1. This is really the starting point for most teams. And at this point, processes are pretty much ad hoc, chaotic, one-off affairs. Everybody does something a little different. And the success of the product largely depends on various individual efforts, those superheroes. There's a lack of stable and predictable processes. So obviously, as a UX designer, when you're included, what meetings you're invited to, who you talk to, what they'll ask for, and whether or not it actually gets built can change day to day. Now, it's worth noting here that this doesn't necessarily mean that you'll actually have a hard time. You may get lucky and work with a few people who are actually very amazing and everything works out. The problem with this first stage is that it's a total crapshoot. Nothing's repeatable or scalable. So if you're on a small team, it might be perfectly okay. The problem here is that as the team grows, or if you're embedded with multiple teams, it makes it harder and harder for UX designer to do their job. So manage, next level. At this stage, products have requirements management, processes are planned, they're performed, they might be monitored, they might be controlled, but the procedures may not be consistent across the organization. So this phase is a little different from the first in that there is something there. We don't have much, but we have some concept of requirements. Maybe we have a specific tool like Rally or Jira. Maybe we have some specific format for user stories or acceptance criteria, but not a lot is documented. No one's really sharing ideas and things are still inconsistent. So same as before, from the UX perspective, this won't mean you can't do your job. It just might mean it's harder. All right, the next level, defined. At this stage, processes across the organization might be well documented and understood. There might be standards, procedures, tools, methods that ensure consistency across the entire organization. So unlike the previous stage where people have some good ideas, we're starting to write them down, we're starting to share them, we're starting to make sure that it's standard across the team. We're starting to make sure there's consistency with how the teams might work. Now, generally speaking, at this stage, you may have a DevOps person who's working to ensure that these things are happening, kind of orchestrating things and making sure people are following these processes. And this should hopefully start to make it easier for UX teams too. And with documentation comes more efficient onboarding. So if you join a team and they have some of this standard work documented, you can read through it and you can get a sense of what's happening when, who's doing it, all those things. And hopefully things are starting to get a little bit easier on you because you'll know what to expect from each team. And hopefully those teams also know what to expect from you. Now, ideally, UX is part of that documented engineering process. So if it's not, see what you can do to get your team in there as a critical partner to work with. Maybe a UX quality gate or something like that would be nice so we're not shipping junk. All right, so the next stage, quantitatively managed. At this stage, the organization uses various metrics to control different processes and identify areas that might need improvement. They might be using metrics to understand the quality of the output and the effectiveness of the overall process. And teams are likely to be using some different numbers here, like cycle time, on-time delivery, defect escapes, code coverage. There might be even a bunch of Agile-specific metrics here, like velocity or burn down and say-do ratios. There's a ton of metrics that the teams can track. Now, what's interesting here is there's a level of maturity around how a team might use metrics. Now, there isn't a whole lot here that will directly affect a UX team, although metrics tend to stress a lot of engineers out, which can lead to unhappy engineers, which often means it's affecting your working environment, especially when the metrics are weaponized and they're used to punish, which again goes back to that low metrics maturity. Now, it's still important for UX team to understand these things so that they can better understand what's important for the engineering teams. So keep an eye on those metrics. Now, the last level, optimizing. This is the highest maturity level. This is where processes are continually improved. So at this stage, you've got everything documented and standardized, it's consistent, but you don't stop there. Your teams are constantly taking feedback from things like sprint retros, some of those metrics to improve how the team works. For UX designers, the big thing here is to be a part of that feedback loop. If you're not speaking up to improve how engineers and UX can collaborate, you're missing out on a huge opportunity to make your job easier. Now, what's interesting at these lower stages is that you can start to see how the level of maturity can impact other teams, even if their own operational maturity is high. Now, in this case, if the product team has everything documented, they operate efficiently, but the engineering team doesn't have processes in place, it starts to fall apart when it comes time to build these things. And vice versa. If the engineering team has everything documented, processes are streamlined, everybody knows how to do their job, but if the product team can't work to get requirements and do all the things a product team should be doing, what's going to get built with that uber efficient engineering process? Nothing. So the operational maturity of every team has to be aligned so that we're all operating at the same level. So we talked about the various levels, but let's talk about some things that you might see to help you determine if the team you're working with has a high or low maturity. Let's talk about low maturity teams. On a low maturity team, like we talked about before, processes are usually ad hoc. They're often described as chaotic. They're all over the place. Success probably depends on those individual heroes swooping in to save the day rather than some reliable or predictable process. There's probably a lack of clear roles and responsibilities. People might be stepping on each other's toes. People might be getting offended somebody did their job. Now, different from the product team, we're not going to have the overlap between UX in engineering like we did in product, but you're still going to see these issues with who does this, who does that. It's going to be hard to say. Things often go over budget. Schedules and timelines might be all over the place. The quality of software from different teams can vary widely. Bugs might be very common. From the UX side, you might find that you're left out of meetings or teams aren't including you in discussions. Engineers might ignore the UX team completely. They might never look at your mockups or your wireframes. They might build whatever they want. And often what ends up in production looks nothing like what you've designed. Now, on high maturity teams, again, it's really the opposite. There are standardized, repeatable processes in place. The processes are understood. They're followed throughout the organization. Things are completed on schedule and within budget. Most of the time, nothing's ever perfect, obviously. Roles and responsibilities are clearly defined and they're well understood. The organization actively manages and optimizes its processes based on data. The software developed is pretty high quality. Not a lot of bugs make it to production, but obviously things happen. There's often the DevOps leader, or at least a few key people who make sure things are running efficiently. And on the UX side, engineers and designers understand where they fit, how they work together. They often collaborate to solve problems. Engineers will come to the UX team before building or changing something. There may be a UX quality gate to make sure that the right designs are used, but I don't know that the quality gate is always necessary. There won't be a lot of surprises on the UX side, and what's in production would generally match what you've designed. So just like with UX maturity, the software maturity model, it helps different orgs to take a look at their current level of processes and try to identify areas that they might need to improve. And it helps them to try to move towards some mature practices, which ultimately leads to more efficient processes overall and better quality, which means happy users. So I think it's really important for UX designers to recognize this model because it helps us to understand some of these operational nuances of the team. And really, this will ultimately impact a lot of the implementation of the UX processes and the designs. So it's really important for us to understand all these things. Now, before we get too far into it, just like last time, I want to set some ground rules. First, I think it's important to understand that engineers get a bad rap for being antisocial robots who just want to bang on a keyboard and spit out code in a corner alone. Leave them alone, don't talk to them, they probably smell anyway, right? Well, I've worked with a ton of engineers over the years from all over the world, and honestly, I don't believe any of those stereotypes are true. Engineers are brilliant people. They're way smarter than me. They all care deeply about the product that they work on. They all want to solve problems. They want to do it in creative ways, and they want to collaborate. And a lot of them are way cooler than me, to be honest, which, maybe isn't saying all that much. I don't know. Now, sure, there are outliers that fit the stereotypes, but I do not think that they're the norm. And again, the goal of this series is not to take a level 1 maturity software org and turn them into a level 5. That isn't our job as UX designers. Your job is to figure out how to work with these teams, right? Think globally, act locally is something I want you to keep in mind here. So let's talk through some issues that you might run into when your UX team is working with engineers with low operational maturity. Now, this isn't an unabridged list. This is just a few that I picked out. So there's going to be more that we didn't talk about here, but these are a few of the big ones. So first, a lack of defined processes. Now, when we're working with low maturity software teams, not having an overall process can be pretty painful. Overall, it's hard to know when you need to have your work done, let alone what type of work. And different engineers may have different expectations when it comes to what they need to do their own work. They may expect it at different times. They may want you in their Scrum ceremonies or they may not. And it can be really hard to know who to talk to when you see something that needs to be changed. Next is insufficient collaboration. Now, low maturity teams might not have a culture of collaboration, and this can obviously make it hard for UX designers to work with developers. And when we don't have a culture that pushes for collaboration, it can lead to UXing being undervalued, really, or even just completely overlooked. And it ultimately means that we might not have a say in what's going on with the team. Next is an overemphasis on speed. In a low maturity environment, there might be this overemphasis on delivering features as quickly as possible at the expense of quality. This rush can lead to things like bugs, usability issues, which obviously leads to a subpar user experience. But beyond that, it could mean that you're given no time to do the work that you need to do, like research, or you may be given a week or two or a sprint to turn around a design. Now, obviously, that's going to mean we're not delivering high-quality work, which, again, the users are going to suffer. Kind of going along with that, short-term focus. Now, you might see teams like this focusing on delivering immediate results. Maybe they're thinking 1 quarter out. They aren't thinking long-term, though. They're not investing in platform-level foundational things, and that makes iterating and improving things later a lot more difficult. Technical limitations might often override UX. Engineers in low maturity teams might prioritize what's easy for them over making a better user experience. They might make design decisions based on what's easiest to implement rather than what's best for users. Now, I think we see this way too often. It ends up resulting in a product that technically functions, but it falls very short in terms of usability, and it doesn't solve users' problems. The next big one is ignoring prototypes. This one's probably the most common. Engineers may ignore wireframes or prototypes completely. They'll just build whatever they want. Or if they reference the designs, they might just ignore parts of it, which can definitely lead to inconsistency across the product. It's not good. Next is this overemphasis on handoffs. Now, on the other end of this problem, you might see a strict emphasis on handoffs, where designers have to spend tons of time speccing every little thing as opposed to having a standard design system or more collaboration. And it means we have to spend a lot of that time doing non-value added work, which I don't think most of us really want to do. And kind of going along with that is inconsistent design systems. So low maturity teams might not have a robust design system in place, which will eventually lead to inconsistencies in the interface across the product. Now, depending on the size of the team, this can make it really hard for the UX team to keep track of inconsistency, which leads us to more non-value added work. Another is overemphasis on features over user needs. Now, teams with low operational maturity might focus more on adding features rather than addressing design debt or improving already released features. And it's really hard for UX designers to shift the focus from that feature-driven development to a more user-centered design. A lot of times this goes hand in hand with low product maturity orgs that end up being more like feature factories. So when you see this on the engineering team, probably a good chance the product team has a low maturity as well. And the last one to highlight here is limited understanding of UX value. So all these issues lead to one big thing, and that is the unfortunate fact that the team may not understand the value that the UX team can bring to the product. And it's a damn shame if you ask me. Now, it should be obvious here that these 10 things are not the only problems that you'll see when you work with a low maturity software team. There are tons of other things that you might run into. So keep your eyes open for things that just don't seem quite right. Now, again, the goal of this series is to figure out how to work well with your team. It's not to change the entire organization. So I want to give an example from my own work to show you how you can do this, and then we'll dive into some more specific tips and tricks after. So a few years back, I worked on this rather large project at GE. And I was the UX lead working with a team of about 5 designers under me at our peak. 2 in the US in my office, 1 in California, and then 2 in Europe. We had engineering and product teams in Budapest at one point, and then Warsaw later, and then also engineering and product teams in the US as well. And as large as we had about 70 engineers in total working on the product. We had about 7 technical product managers, a couple product managers, and then 1 program manager. Now, in this particular instance, it wasn't that the engineering teams had super low maturity. They were probably at about a 3 based on the criteria that we laid out before. So it wasn't totally bad. But as we grew, we had some growing pains, and I want to talk through how we took what could have been a bad situation and we made it work out pretty well for us. So I started off as the UX designer assigned to this particular product. The product had 2 engineering teams for a year or so in New Orleans. And it was pretty straightforward. Your standard UX design process with research and wireframing, prototyping, testing, agile development, you know the drill. After about a year or so, the business decided to throw more money at this product, and we brought on 4 pods in Europe to support the team. Now, along with the 4 pods, I ended up with 2 UX designers in Europe, and a little while later, I got 2 more UX designers in the office with me in New Orleans. Now, it all sounds great, except in reality, we had some growing pains. But our UX team and the engineers, and sometimes even the product team, we'd butt heads. It's kind of your standard stuff, right? Things ended up in production that weren't what we designed. Components were inconsistent across all the various features. Different teams would expect deliverables in different ways. Some would want redline specs and what you might call a more traditional handoff. Some wanted more collaboration. Some wanted us in every Scrum ceremony, and some didn't. Meeting times would often overlap, and we'd have to miss meetings. So we'd obviously miss out on information. Then someone might get upset. Little things like that ultimately ended up creating bigger issues later. And we'd often get pushback on things that we wanted to build. We'd have engineers question why we wanted to do certain things, right? We had an overall lack of understanding of what we were building and why it was important. But we had teams spread out across different time zones and continents and languages and cultures. So there were a lot of potential things that could have gone wrong. And it wasn't easy to coordinate and plan with all these people. And there were a lot of things that were kind of happening. But to make a long story short, we all kind of felt like it wasn't working as well as it could. And it was definitely stressing my team out, but you could tell it was stressing out the engineers and to some degree the product team as well. Now, the people we had on our team were brilliant. They were all very serious about quality. They were serious about documentation. They were serious about collaboration. And they were serious about doing overall great work. I think it's worth noting here that there were not any assholes on the team. So the stuff that I'm about to talk about may not have worked necessarily if there were people actively pushing to undermine us. Now, it's certainly possible the things that we did to fix our issues may not have worked had we had a completely different set of personalities. I think that's worth pointing out. So one day I was sitting in the break room eating lunch, and I overheard two engineers arguing about some feature in the product that we were building. Now, this is the kind of stuff that you don't really hear anymore with remote work, which is kind of a bummer. This happened a few years back, and if this happened today, it probably would have been in a DM on Slack, and I probably would have never heard the conversation, and who knows what would have happened. So I hear these two engineers arguing or debating, and what I realized was that neither one of them were right. They were both wrong. And at that point, what I realized is that the UX team is disconnected from the engineers. We're over here doing our thing and maybe complaining about the engineers, but were we present enough? If we were present, wouldn't these engineers have known about the things that they were building? So I brought this back to the UX team, and we decided to UX the shit out of this problem. So we started off with some research. We did some interviews specifically, and then eventually we did a survey. We wanted to track a few things, right? Wireframe accuracy. How accurate were the wireframes? Did it help them do their job? How easy it was to use the design system that we had. How available the UX team was in the various touch points. The overall UX process as it was at that point, if it worked well for them or not. How much knowledge they had on the end users, whether or not they really understood what they were building, and then just general improvement ideas. So what we found was pretty remarkable. 42% found that the design system that we had was hard to use, which meant they weren't implementing it. Many wanted the UX team to be more present. Many felt that we were slow to respond when there were changes that needed to be made or when questions or issues came up. And this is the big one. 84% felt that they had little insight into the end users. They didn't understand what they were building and why it mattered. So I could do an entire episode about this, but to try to make this as quick as possible, the point here and how it relates to the issues today is that we had issues with the engineers not working like we wanted, and it made our jobs harder. Now, we could have blamed it on them and expected them to change, or we could have done something about our situation and try to work with them to improve it for everybody. So we made some changes. Here's a few things that we did. We decided to break our team of 5 designers into dedicated UX resources by assigning each designer to 2 specific pods. Now, this way, each pod knew exactly who to talk to, and each designer was way more in tune with what those pods were working on. We made a point to attend as many Scrum ceremonies as possible, so things like daily stand-up, sprint planning, retros, and since we started doing that dedicated UX designer to pod, this was actually a lot easier to organize, change the rhythm for the pod so that the designers could attend both the meetings. We work with the product managers to make sure that we use those planning sessions to review wireframes and answer whatever questions before the engineers started to do their work. That way they could just jump right in without getting confused and wasting time context switching. We created some UX acceptance criteria for user stories so that there were some items for that QA team to reference as they were reviewing the stories. And we caught a lot of potential design defects doing this too. We worked closely with the lead engineers to implement a component library using Storybook.js. This was really cool. And this is something that the team owned and maintained. And this helped all the engineers, but it helped us too. And I'll talk more about Storybook in a minute. We implemented what we called a Shop Talk series at each of the sites where the UX team spent about an hour each month reviewing various business processes, and we answered some general questions that the engineers might have had. We encouraged all the engineers to kind of come up with topics that they felt they didn't understand for future sessions, so it got them engaged, and we recorded it all for future team members to reference as part of onboarding. So we ended up reducing a lot of time spent answering questions later. It actually helped us out quite a bit. We created what we called a mini brief that helped explain things like different development features, the business impact, and we defined the applicable personas and their pain points related to the feature. And then we reviewed these in all the sprint planning meetings, and then we attached them to the user stories. We printed them out. We put them up on the walls where the teams were doing all their stand-ups so that they could reference these whenever they met each day. We brought in functional teams to the sites to explain all the processes and try to provide insights on the users. The teams would bring actual components and other things from the shops, so like actual blades and stuff, so that the engineers could actually hold them and understand what it's like to handle some of these engine parts. We made a rule going forward that each research trip would have at least one engineer in attendance as a note taker or something to help build empathy for users and understand their pain points and their needs. Then during each research trip, we would document our experience with like a fun video blog of what we learned that day, and then we would share it back with the team at home. So we tried to make it as fun as possible so that the teams would get excited about the trips and actually want to go. And we may or may not have went out for karaoke as much as possible too. I can't quite remember. Now, over time, we saw a dramatic improvement in how our teams work together. We did this survey every quarter, and you could see the improvement from a qualitative perspective and from a quantitative perspective. We felt the relationships improve, and we could also look at the numbers and see those moving upwards as well. We stopped getting pushback. We started getting included more. We put in the effort, and it worked. But we didn't change the way the entire GE engineering team or those 1,000 engineers worked. We acted locally, and we improved the way that our specific core team worked. We didn't try to boil the ocean. I think that's really important to remember here. So I hope that example helps a bit to show how you might be able to take some of the things that we're talking about and try to improve how you and your team can work together. And with that said, here are some things that you can think about, but remember, this is not absolutely everything. This is a starter list to think through. And hopefully this will spark some ideas for you to try to come up with some other ideas. Now remember, in this last episode on the product team's operational maturity, we talked a lot about assuming positive intent, fostering relationships, building bridges, finding allies, and lots of other things. Most of the things that we talked about in the last episode will most definitely apply here too. So make sure you check out episode 33 for some other great general tips to deal with a low maturity team. First is add to your stakeholder map. Remember that product stakeholder map that we talked about in episode 33? We're going to add to that now. So grab your stakeholder map and start filling out your engineering team. Put on the important decision makers, maybe pod leads or lead front end or back end engineers, maybe engineering directors or leaders. Whoever makes important decisions related to engineering matters. And it's important to also highlight the relationship between the product and engineering. So draw those lines and make some notes about who is allied with who gets along, who doesn't, who has whose ear, who doesn't. And this is super important to understand as you start to think about who you might need to get on your side if you're looking to change things or to improve how the teams work with your team. Next is collaborate early and often and try to avoid the handoffs. And one of the best ways to improve how you work with the team is to collaborate early and often. And this helps you by getting insight early into how the product functions, whatever the technical limitations might be. It saves you time designing something that won't ever work, but it also adds trust between you and the engineers. And they know that you know what is possible, and they are more willing to help you when you need it because you've put in the work. Now, it saves you time so you don't have to go back and redesign the feature later. It also means that you can avoid the handoff. And since the engineer was involved early, they have the context, they understand how it should function, and there's no reason to spend all that time speccing every little thing out. And since you've built up a relationship, it's easy to have a quick conversation when something comes up. Next is explain the product and the process. Now, if you're building a simple chat app, it might not be necessary to do something like this. But if you're working on a really complex application or maybe a complex enterprise tool, there is a good possibility that your engineering teams don't fully understand what the tool actually does or how the users use the tool and why that even matters. So like I said before, I really do think engineers are creative and they want to do great work. Now, if your engineers intimately understand what they're building and why, they might have some amazing ideas. Or they might be able to suggest better ways to implement some different types of functionality. But it's a lot harder for them to do that if they don't understand what's going on. So if you find this is the case, set up some sessions to explain the process or set up a Q&A session, or at the very least, make sure your team knows that they can come to you with questions, no matter how stupid they think it might be. Try to have an open door policy. Next is bring them along for research. Now, a great way to get the team to understand what users are doing is to include them in the research. Now, I'm not saying have them do the research. What I mean is bring them along maybe as a note taker. Let them sit in on interviews or usability studies just to get that firsthand experience. Let them see the pain points firsthand. Let them see what users want. Let them see the product of their labor firsthand. That is such a powerful thing. And this is a great way to help build empathy and experience that process, like I said, firsthand. But what's really cool is that when they get back from these research trips, you can just see how the light goes off. They just instantly get it. If they didn't get it before, you can just see how it clicks. Now, what's really cool is you might see how they become an advocate for what we do. They might see the value we bring, and then when they get back from these trips, they're telling everybody about how amazing it was and how awesome it was to see all this stuff firsthand. It's amazing to see it. Next is thinking about design systems or component libraries. Really try to embrace the consistency. The engineers want to work smarter, not harder. You probably won't get much pushback on this one, at least not from engineers. Now, if it's possible to do, try to encourage the use of a design system, or at the very least, a component library, something like Vuetify or Material, or something similar. Now remember that a design system is not just a Figma component library or a style guide. A design system is more than wireframe designs. It's more than some JavaScript components. It's how the components are used or not used. It's the design language, it's the voice, it's the tone, it's the documentation. And this one is not an easy task, but if the resources are available, this can make your job a lot easier. So if you don't have the resources, maybe you can use an open source library like Material or Vuetify like I talked about. If engineers can have a place to grab code snippets, something that is well documented, that is standard and shared across all the engineers, it means your designs are now consistent. Code is consistent, and the user sees the same thing that works the same way no matter who built it and where it lives in the application. Now, this is huge if your team can support it. Next is you can use a tool like Storybook.js. Now, if your team doesn't have the resources to go full-on bespoke design system, you can work with them to utilize something like Storybook. Now, this is a really cool tool that allows the engineers to put whatever code they're using for components in a central place. They can document it. They can share the code base with the rest of the team. Now, this has the added benefit of allowing the design team to actually visualize what the production components look like to make sure that what is in production actually matches the designs. Now, this is an awesome tool for engineers, but it's great for the UX team too, because it adds a bit of transparency that allows the team to make sure edits are actually made and shared with the team before it's too late. Next is let them give advice on components and things like that. Now, even if you don't use a tool like Storybook, we can still improve how we collaborate. The engineers can still give input on various components and make them work better for them. Now, when we're designing components, give the engineers an opportunity to give feedback on how the various components should actually work. They may have some great ideas that you had never thought of, but it'll also give them time to think about how to implement it so they aren't waiting until the last minute. Now, this is another win-win for both teams. All right, one of the last ones, I think one of the biggest ones, is attend as many Scrum ceremonies as you can. Now, a great way to keep your ear to the ground is to attend all those Scrum ceremonies, and if you're not doing this, you may be surprised how much you're missing. Every day during stand-up, the engineers are talking about what they're building, how they're building things, the problems that they're running into. And this is a great opportunity to see if somebody needs help with something or catch something that doesn't sound right. Now, if you're working with multiple teams, you might be able to actually point out that other teams are working on something so you can connect them, or you can point out how something's inconsistent and encourage them to work together. Now, attending sprint planning gives you a really great idea of what's coming up over the next 2 weeks. You might be able to help explain a feature that the team is about to start working on. Attending retros are a great opportunity to give input in how the teams can work more effectively with UX. Are you seeing issues that can be resolved by including you? Bring it up. Are you seeing issues that can be resolved with more cross-team collaboration? Bring it up. Are you seeing opportunities to improve how you work with the engineering team in general? Bring it up. Demos are a great place for you to catch issues. Now, at this point, it may be too late, but if you miss something, this is a really great opportunity to note it down, bring it to the product manager or Scrum Master, and add it to the backlog to fix later. All right, so we talked about a lot of stuff today. Now, before we get out of here, let's do a quick recap of what we talked about. First, remember that the point of this is not to change how the entire engineering team works. If you're in a large company, it's probably not going to happen. So instead, think about what you can do to improve the situation on your core team. Work to improve the relationship and the process of the people that you work with every day. It doesn't matter if other teams don't also do this necessarily. What matters is that your team changes how they work. Now, we talked about some universal things in the last episode on product team maturity that will definitely apply here. Remember to assume positive intent. Most engineers are really smart. They're super creative people. They want to solve problems just like you. And more often than not, they would love to collaborate with you if you give them a chance. Now, fostering relationships here is just as critical as it is with every other team. Find allies that exist out there and work with them to see if they can help you improve how the teams work. Remember, you do not have to do this all on your own. Now, for engineering teams, we need to make sure that we collaborate early and often. It's never too early to bring your engineers in and get feedback on the feasibility of what you're doing. If you're working on a really complex problem, don't assume that the engineers know everything you do about users and their pain points. Do your best to evangelize and set up whatever systems you need to set up to help your engineers better understand what they're building and why it matters. Bring the engineers along when you do research. If they can travel with you, awesome. If they can sit in an interview or usability study, that's great too. Do whatever you can to let them peek behind the curtains and see what we do firsthand. And let them get a sense for how people will use what they're building. They will love that. Try to push for the adoption of a design system if your team can support it, but if not, push for an open source library, then document it with something like Storybook. And try to attend as many Scrum ceremonies as you can. This is a great way to keep your ear to the ground and catch things early. It also helps to build relationships when you see people and talk to them every single day. Well, all right, y'all, that's it for me for today. I hope to help to make the relationship with your engineering teams a little bit better. But I'm curious, has anyone out there worked to improve how they operate with their engineering team? Did you try any of these things I laid out here? Was any of it helpful? Was there anything I missed that you think is worth calling out? Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would love it if you left a 5-star review. That would help me out way more than you know. And if you know somebody who might find any of this stuff useful, why don't you tell them about it? That'd be fantastic. And if you want to help keep the show independent and ad-free, check out all those Patreon sponsorship packages at beyonduxdesign.com/support. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, and Kevin by supporting the show for as little as $3 a month. That's less than $1 an episode. And there are some awesome perks like that badass holographic Beyond UX Design sticker. You can get a shout out in the show every week, and there's even a package to meet with me for 30 minutes every month. And don't forget to head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/audible trial to download Influencer, the new science of leading change. Sign up for a free 30-day Audible trial, cancel at any time, and the book is yours to keep forever. And in case you forgot, I've partnered with audible.com, so anytime you sign up for a free trial, you'll help support the show. There's no obligation, and you can cancel at any time, and the audiobook is yours to keep forever. So get a free audiobook on me and help support the show. Remember to sign up for the newsletter and check out all the past episodes along with all the show notes at beyonduxdesign.com. I hope you keep coming back for more great UX tips from Beyond UX Design. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX than design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all.